On December 7th, 1941, at precisely 7:55 in the morning, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching the first wave of aircraft disappear into the dawn sky over Pearl Harbor. The ocean below shimmered like polished steel, and the air temperature hovered at a comfortable 72 degrees. His staff officers exchanged confident glances, their faces reflecting the certainty of men who believed they had just changed the course of history with a single, devastating strike. What none of them could have imagined was that this very morning would plant the seeds of a transformation in warfare so profound that within 4 years, the entire concept of naval supremacy would be rewritten, and the mighty battleships they considered invincible would become obsolete relics of a vanished age. The Japanese Imperial Navy had spent decades perfecting the art of battleship warfare. Officers like Rear Admiral Matomu Ugaki believed with absolute conviction that aircraft were merely supporting players in the grand theater of naval combat. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these experienced commanders were about to witness would shatter every assumption they held about sea power, as American innovation and industrial might would prove that the age of the battleship had ended the moment the first torpedo dropped from an aircraft's belly. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led that first wave over Oahu, commanding 183 aircraft that included 40 torpedo bombers. These Nakajima B-5N aircraft, which the Americans would later codename Kate, carried specially modified Type 91 aerial torpedoes. Japanese engineers had spent months solving a problem that seemed impossible: how to launch torpedoes in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, which averaged only 40 feet deep. Traditional torpedoes dove too deep after release, burying themselves in the harbor bottom. The solution was elegant: wooden fins attached to the torpedoes to keep them running shallow, combined with a release altitude of just 40 meters. These modifications would prove devastatingly effective against the American battleships moored along Ford Island. As Fuchida's aircraft descended toward Battleship Row, he could see 8 massive warships lined up like toys in a bathtub. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the California, the West Virginia, the Nevada, the Tennessee, the Maryland, and the Pennsylvania represented the backbone of American Pacific naval power. These vessels, displaced between 29,000 and 33,000 tons each, carried main batteries of either 8 or 12 14-inch guns and were protected by armor belts up to 13 inches thick. To the battleship admirals of both nations, these floating fortresses represented the ultimate expression of naval power. The idea that aircraft, fragile machines made of aluminum and fabric, could threaten such titans seemed almost laughable. Petty Officer First Class Noboru Kanai piloted his Kate torpedo bomber toward the Oklahoma. He had trained for this mission for months, practicing against a mock-up of Pearl Harbor constructed in Kagoshima Bay. His orders were explicit: fly at precisely 40 meters altitude, maintain 130 knots airspeed, release at 800 meters from the target, and climb immediately to avoid the splash. Through his cockpit window, he could see sailors on the Oklahoma's deck moving about their Sunday morning routines, completely unaware of the conflict about to unfold. At 7:57, Kanai pressed his release button, felt his aircraft lift slightly as the torpedo dropped away, and watched the weapon enter the water with barely a splash, its wooden fins keeping it on a deadly shallow trajectory. The torpedo struck the Oklahoma amidships at precisely 7:58. Within 2 minutes, 8 more torpedoes had hit the massive battleship along her port side. Each weapon carried 450 pounds of explosives. The combined force of these detonations ripped enormous holes in the Oklahoma's hull below the waterline. Seawater poured in at a rate of thousands of tons per minute. Ensign Francis Flaherty and Seaman First Class James Ward, trapped below decks, held flashlights so their shipmates could escape before the compartments flooded completely. Within 12 minutes of the first strike, the Oklahoma began rolling over, her massive hull turning turtle as seawater filled her interior spaces. Below decks on the capsized Oklahoma, more than 400 men found themselves trapped in darkness, in compartments that had suddenly become inverted prisons. Some managed to survive in air pockets, breathing the increasingly foul air and listening to the sounds of cutting torches above them as rescue crews worked desperately to free them. Julio de Castro and 31 other sailors were cut free after more than 24 hours, but for most, the darkness became their final resting place. The mighty battleship, which was supposed to be unsinkable, had been defeated in minutes by weapons delivered from the air. Across the harbor, the Arizona met an even more catastrophic fate. At 8:06, a modified 16-inch naval shell, converted into an armor-piercing bomb and dropped from a high-altitude bomber, penetrated the Arizona's forward deck and detonated inside her forward ammunition magazine. The explosion that followed was so massive it lifted the ship's bow out of the water. 1,177 sailors perished in that single moment as the ship's magazine, containing more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder, exploded with the force of a tactical device. The battleship that was supposed to be protected by her heavy armor had been defeated by an attack from above, from an angle her designers never adequately considered. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito observed the attack from his position aboard the carrier Hiryu, analyzing the results with the clinical precision of a staff officer trained in naval warfare theory. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in 1928, studying under instructors who preached the gospel of battleship supremacy. The Standard Doctrine taught that naval battles would be decided by main battery guns firing at ranges of 20 to 30 kilometers, with aircraft serving merely as scouts to spot enemy positions. What he witnessed at Pearl Harbor contradicted every lesson from his academy days. Aircraft had achieved in minutes what battleship guns would have taken hours to accomplish if they could have done it at all. But even as the smoke rose over Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval leadership refused to fully embrace the implications of what had occurred. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood that aircraft carriers had become the new capital ships of modern navies. However, many of his colleagues, including Admirals Ugaki and Kurita, remained wedded to the battleship doctrine. They viewed Pearl Harbor as an exceptional circumstance, a surprise attack against unprepared opponents. In a conventional fleet engagement, they believed, battleships would still reign supreme. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove catastrophic for Japan. The American response would demonstrate an entirely different philosophy. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, who would become one of the Pacific conflict's most successful carrier commanders, understood immediately that the age of the battleship was over. His perspective was shared by Admiral William Halsey, Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Admiral Thomas Kincaid. These officers would spend the next 4 years proving that carrier-based aircraft, not battleship guns, would determine the outcome of the Pacific conflict. Their Japanese counterparts, clinging to outdated doctrine, would learn this lesson the hardest way possible. The transformation in American naval aviation between 1941 and 1945 represented one of the most remarkable industrial and technological achievements in military history. In December 1941, the United States Navy possessed 7 aircraft carriers. By August 1945, that number had grown to 99, including fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. American shipyards produced these vessels at a rate that seemed impossible to Japan's leadership. The Essex-class fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons and capable of carrying 90 aircraft, were being completed in an average of 16 months from keel laying to commissioning. The numbers were even more staggering for aircraft production. In 1941, American factories produced 5,888 military aircraft. By 1944, that number had exploded to 96,318 aircraft in a single year. Japanese production peaked at 28,180 aircraft in 1944, and quality control deteriorated as the situation progressed. American pilots flew aircraft with superior engines, better armament, and more advanced electronics. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, achieved a victory ratio of 19-1 against Japanese opponents. The Americans were not just winning through numbers, they were winning through technological superiority. Captain Tamechi Hara commanded the destroyer Shigura through multiple major engagements in the Pacific. His memoirs provide insight into how Japanese naval officers experienced the growing American dominance. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Hara watched in horror as American carrier aircraft systematically defeated Japanese naval aviation in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many with less than 6 months training, flew inferior aircraft against American aviators who had years of experience and far superior planes. In a single day, the Japanese Navy lost more than 600 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, and most of those pilots were rescued. Hara wrote that watching the one-sided encounter was like witnessing a tragedy unfold. The young Japanese pilots, brave and determined but hopelessly outmatched, flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of American fighters. They had been taught that spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantage. They learned, in the most terrible way possible, that this was a misconception. The Americans had both superior spirit and overwhelming material advantage. There was no answer to this combination. The Japanese battleship Musashi, sister ship to the legendary Yamato, provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of how thoroughly the battleship era had ended. Built in absolute secrecy at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki, the Musashi displaced 72,800 tons fully loaded, making her one of the 2 largest battleships ever constructed. Her main battery consisted of 9 18-inch guns, the most powerful naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, backed by an anti-torpedo bulge that designers believed made her virtually unsinkable. Admiral Ugaki personally assured the Imperial General Staff that no combination of air attacks could send the Musashi to the bottom. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, American carrier aircraft found the Musashi transiting the Sibuyan Sea. What followed was not an engagement but a systematic dismantling. Between 10:30 in the morning and 7:30 in the evening, aircraft from the carriers Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, Franklin, and Intrepid made 5 separate attack waves on the massive battleship. Fighter aircraft strafed her decks to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Dive bombers struck from high altitude, while torpedo bombers came in at wave-top level from multiple directions simultaneously. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida served aboard the Musashi as assistant radar officer. His account of the ship's final hours provides devastating detail about what it meant to be on the receiving end of American air power. The first torpedo struck at 10:27, flooding several compartments, but not significantly affecting the ship's combat ability. The crew's initial confidence remained high. They had been told the Musashi could withstand 20 torpedo hits. Surely the Americans did not have 20 torpedoes to spare on a single ship. By the third attack wave at 1:30 in the afternoon, that confidence began to crack. 10 more torpedoes had struck, along with numerous bomb hits. The Musashi was listing 7 degrees to port, and counterflooding had reduced her speed to 22 knots. Yoshida could feel the ship becoming sluggish, responding slowly to helm commands. Water was spreading through the lower decks, despite the heroic efforts of damage control parties. The supposedly unsinkable battleship was slowly succumbing. The 4th and 5th attack waves were relentless. American pilots, seeing the wounded giant limping through the sea, focused their attacks with ruthless efficiency. By the time the attacks ended, the Musashi had absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes. Her list increased to 30 degrees. Water filled her engine rooms. At 7:15 in the evening, Rear Admiral Toshihira Inoguchi gave the order to abandon ship. Half an hour later, the Musashi rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her into the depths, including Admiral Inoguchi, who chose to remain with his command. The Americans had expended approximately 250 aircraft sorties to sink the Musashi. They lost 18 aircraft in the effort. It seemed like a high cost until one considered the alternative. If the Musashi had reached the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, her 9 18-inch guns could have devastated the invasion fleet. Each of those guns fired shells weighing 3,200 pounds to a range of 42 kilometers. A single broadside from the Musashi represented nearly 15 tons of high explosive, delivered with frightening accuracy. The loss of 18 aircraft to eliminate this threat was in cold military calculation, a worthwhile exchange. Commander Yoshimura Tanaka, a staff officer who survived the sinking, was picked up by a destroyer after spending 6 hours in the water. His report to Admiral Kurita, commander of the center force to which Musashi had belonged, was blunt. Aircraft had rendered battleships obsolete as offensive weapons. No amount of armor or anti-aircraft guns could protect a battleship from determined carrier air attack. Tanaka recommended that all remaining battleships be withdrawn to home waters for coastal defense only, where they might benefit from land-based air cover. Admiral Kurita ignored this advice. The following day, his force, centered around the super battleship Yamato, engaged American escort carriers and destroyers in the Battle off Samar. Despite overwhelming superiority in firepower, the Japanese force withdrew after inflicting modest losses on the Americans. Kurita later claimed he believed he was facing fleet carriers, not the much smaller escort carriers that were actually present. In reality, Kurita had lost his resolve. The psychological impact of the Musashi's destruction, combined with constant air attacks throughout October 24th, had shaken his will to press the attack. The battleship Admiral had learned to fear aircraft more than enemy surface ships. The final chapter of battleship warfare came in April 1945 during Operation Tengo, the final mission of the battleship Yamato. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito commanded this operation, leading the Yamato and a small escort force on a one-way mission to Okinawa. The plan called for the Yamato to beach herself and use her massive guns to defend against the American invasion. The operation was desperate from the start. The Yamato had been given only enough fuel for a one-way trip. No air cover would be provided. Japanese leadership knew the mission would likely fail, but ordered it anyway, believing that such a dramatic sacrifice might inspire the nation to continue fighting. On April 7, 1945, American submarines spotted the Yamato departing the inland sea. Within hours, aircraft from Task Force 58 were airborne. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded this force from the carrier Bunker Hill. He had at his disposal 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, with nearly 400 aircraft available for the strike. Mitcher assigned 386 aircraft to attack the Yamato. There would be no uncertainty, no possibility of escape. The Americans would eliminate the last operational Japanese battleship with overwhelming force. The attack began at 12:30 in the afternoon. The Yamato's crew fought with desperate courage, her anti-aircraft guns firing continuously at the waves of attacking aircraft. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, who had survived the Musashi's sinking and been reassigned to the Yamato, found himself experiencing the nightmare again. The ship shuddered with each torpedo strike. Bomb explosions walked across the deck. The Americans attacked in a coordinated pattern that Japanese anti-aircraft fire could not disrupt. Torpedo bombers came from both sides simultaneously, making evasive maneuvers impossible. When the Yamato turned to avoid torpedoes from port, she exposed her starboard side to other attackers. By 2:05 in the afternoon, the Yamato had suffered 12 torpedo and 7 bomb hits. She listed 18 degrees to port and was taking on water at an uncontrollable rate. Admiral Ito cancelled the mission and ordered the ship abandoned, then retired to his sea cabin to remain with his vessel. At 2:23, the Yamato's forward magazine exploded with tremendous force. The blast was visible 100 miles away. The largest battleship ever built rolled over and sank in 340 meters of water, taking 2,748 sailors beneath the waves. American losses were 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. Chief Warrant Officer Yoshida survived by jumping into the sea moments before the magazine exploded. Floating in the oil-covered water, surrounded by debris and his fallen shipmates, he understood with perfect clarity that the naval warfare his generation had trained for had become extinct. The battleship, which had dominated naval strategy for nearly a century, had been rendered as obsolete as the sailing ship of the line. Aircraft carriers and their embarked air wings now ruled the seas. The transformation was complete. The psychological impact of these defeats on Japanese naval leadership was profound. Admiral Ugaki, who had once mocked the idea that aircraft could threaten battleships, spent the final months of the conflict flying missions in obsolete bomber aircraft, attempting to strike American ships since conventional methods had failed. His diary entries from this period reveal a man who had been psychologically shattered by the systematic destruction of everything he believed about naval warfare. The doctrine he had spent his career perfecting had been proven false. The weapons in which he had placed absolute faith had been swept from the seas. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, who served as a damage control officer aboard multiple Japanese warships, provided perhaps the most succinct analysis of what happened. In his post-conflict testimony, he stated that Japanese naval officers had failed to understand that warfare was undergoing a revolution. They believed that courage, tradition, and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans proved that industrial capacity, technological innovation, and the willingness to abandon outdated doctrine were more important than any amount of fighting spirit. The side that could produce more ships, more aircraft, better weapons, and adapt faster to changing conditions would inevitably prevail. The numbers tell the story starkly. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost all of its battleships, all of its fleet carriers, most of its cruisers and destroyers, and effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. During the same period, the United States Navy grew from fewer than 800 combat ships to more than 6,000, completely dominating the Pacific Ocean. American carrier task forces operated with impunity off the Japanese coast, launching strikes against targets that would have been unreachable by any other means. The transformation in military thought required to accept these new realities proved beyond the capacity of many Japanese officers. They had been taught from their academy days that battleships were supreme. Their entire professional identity was built around the operation and command of these massive vessels. To accept that aircraft had made battleships obsolete was to accept that their life's work had become meaningless. Some officers, like Admiral Yamamoto, made this intellectual leap early and adjusted their thinking. Others never truly accepted the new reality. The American advantage extended beyond mere numbers. American carrier operations demonstrated a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that Japanese forces never matched. American carriers operated in task groups with integrated air defense systems, coordinated fighter direction, and sophisticated logistics that allowed them to remain at sea for months. Japanese carriers, by contrast, operated with inadequate screening forces, primitive radar, and logistics systems that required frequent returns to base for replenishment. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated this disparity perfectly. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded a force of 9 carriers with 450 aircraft. American Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded 15 carriers with 960 aircraft. But the numerical advantage only told part of the story. American carriers operated under a fighter direction system that used radar to vector interceptors toward incoming raids. American anti-aircraft gunnery, controlled by radar-directed fire control systems, created defensive barriers that Japanese aircraft could not penetrate. The result was catastrophic for Japan. In what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Ozawa lost 3 carriers and more than 600 aircraft. American losses were 123 aircraft, most due to fuel exhaustion returning from strikes. After the Philippine Sea, Japan no longer possessed a carrier force capable of challenging American naval dominance. The human cost of Japan's failure to adapt was staggering. Tens of thousands of sailors were lost aboard ships that were supposed to be unsinkable. Thousands of pilots were thrown into encounters with inadequate training against vastly superior opponents. The industrial workers who built these ships and aircraft sacrificed everything for weapon systems that were obsolete before they left the factories. Conversely, American naval leadership demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adopting new methods. Officers who had spent careers in battleships, like Admiral Raymond Spruance, quickly mastered carrier operations and became devastatingly effective carrier task force commanders. The United States Navy reorganized its entire structure around carrier operations, developing new tactical doctrines, training systems, and logistical methods to support this transformation. The story of how aircraft ended the battleship era extends beyond military history. into questions of human nature and institutional change. Why do organizations and individuals cling to outdated methods even when evidence demonstrates those methods no longer work? The Japanese naval leadership's refusal to fully embrace carrier aviation as the dominant form of sea power, despite having successfully demonstrated carrier supremacy at Pearl Harbor, represents a profound failure of imagination and adaptation. The lesson resonates far beyond World War II naval warfare. In any field, military, business, science, or governance, the ability to recognize when fundamental assumptions have become invalid and to adapt accordingly often determines success or failure. The Japanese Navy possessed skilled personnel, adequate industrial capacity for its circumstances, and brilliant tactical innovators. What it lacked was institutional willingness to abandon the battleship-centric doctrine that had defined naval warfare for generations. For the sailors who experienced these transformations firsthand, the psychological burden was immense. Imagine training your entire professional life to operate and maintain battleships, believing these vessels represented the pinnacle of naval power, only to watch them systematically destroyed by aircraft. Imagine the cognitive dissonance of recognizing that everything your instructors taught you was wrong, that the doctrine you memorized was obsolete, that the weapons you trusted would fail. American sailors and airmen, by contrast, experienced the conflict as a validation of their adaptability and industrial strength. They witnessed their nation transform from a minor naval power in 1941 to absolute maritime dominance by 1945. They saw American shipyards produce vessels at rates that seemed impossible. They flew aircraft that improved with each new model. The technological lessons from this transformation shaped post-conflict naval development worldwide. Every major navy recognized that aircraft carriers had become the new capital ships. Naval aviation became the dominant branch of sea services. The weapons and tactics developed during World War II carrier operations formed the basis for Cold-era naval doctrine. The revolution that began when the first torpedo dropped from a Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor continued shaping naval warfare into the 21st century, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.